Right, well, I think we're at 12 o'clock, so I'm going to kick off. I was about to say good morning, everyone, but good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely of you all to join us. I'm Leslie Stevenson, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the publisher of Governance Newsletter, and we are delighted to be working in partnership with the Board Effectiveness Guild again to produce this webinar on the very important topic of the impact of board relationships. The way it's going to run is we've got 4 members of the Board Effectiveness Guild with us, Alex, Chris, Ali and Ian, and 2 of them are going to present, and then we'll stop for questions, and then another 2 will present, and then we'll end up with a panel session at the end for more questions. Because it's a webinar, you can't actually ask me the questions, but if you could put them in the Q&A, ideally rather than the chat, that would be really helpful, because then Zoom records it. If for any reason we don't get through all the questions, we can maybe come back to you. We are recording the webinar and will be released afterwards so that you can have a look again or share it with colleagues or what have you. So with no further ado, I think I would like to, I'd like to move my slides on, but I can't. Why was that not happening? That was happening perfectly well just a minute ago. There you go. So I'm going to introduce, first off, is Alison Gill, who's going to talk about effective challenge. And just tell me when you want me to flip the slide on, and I'll try.
Great. Okay. Well, if you can go on to the first slide, then that's perfect. So, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about the really important topic of how to deliver effective challenge in the boardroom. And I'm sort of basing this really on my experiences of observing boards through doing board reviews and working with boards to help them to improve their effective challenge. I always think the interesting thing is that the Corporate Governance Code specifically advises that non-execs need to provide constructive challenge and hold management to account. But they don't really say what they mean by challenge. They have a sort of, in their guidance on board effectiveness, they talk about the boardroom being a robust place for robust debate where challenge, support and diversity of thought and teamwork are essential. But they don't really sort of explore the topic of challenge, which is a word you hear a lot talked about in boards. But as a board observer, I actually find the level of challenge in boards quite often can be quite minimal. And probably the biggest question what I often ask at a board review is, I ask the execs, to what extent does this board challenge you effectively? And more often than not, the execs want more challenge. I quite often say, be careful what you wish for, but it is a really important thing. So when I'm thinking about challenge, there are 4 specific behaviours that I really encourage people to work on as a non-exec. And I think you can never stop learning, really, how to challenge effectively. And by effectively, I mean in a way which does 4 things. So, Leslie, could you move the slides on?
I'm trying.
So, the 4 behaviours that I think are really, really critical to effective challenge start with empathy. So, to me, empathy is a behaviour which delivers trust. If I can really stand in someone else's shoes and understand things from their perspective, then that's more likely to encourage a sense that when I do challenge people, they will believe that it's from a place of good intention. And there are 4 real, so 3 ways that I like to think about empathy. The first is when you ask questions, you use what I call clean questions. And a clean question is a short question, and it really uses the speaker's language. So if someone has proposed X, I might say, and can you tell me a little bit more about X? Or what kind of X is that? So just short, few words, and using the language of the speaker. And that really encourages people to explain from their perspective. The second is about expressing feelings. So I might say, when I listened to your proposal, I felt really excited for the future. How does that proposal make you feel? So using words about feelings and expressing feelings myself is a really important component of building empathy. And the final technique is around appreciative inquiry. So I might say, I really appreciate the amount of effort that you put into pulling this proposal together. Can you tell me what you found most challenging? So by appreciating first, I'm more likely to draw out an honest and open response. So 3 techniques that help with empathy, and empathy builds trust, and trust sets the scene that my challenge is with good intent. The other 3 behaviours are more about broadening understanding and analysis. So when I read board papers, I like to do it from the perspective of critical thought. So I like to finish a board paper and have my own point of view on the information that's being presented to me. The same when I listen to a presenter in a board meeting, I like to have my own point of view. So it's about independent judgment and seeking to understand causality, not symptoms. The third behaviour, seeking information, is about asking questions that bring breadth or depth. So I'm really looking in my questioning, asking what questions or how questions or why questions, but really with an emphasis of how will this broaden the debate or how will this deepen my understanding. And the fourth and final behaviour is what I call conceptual agility, which is a really critical behaviour to effective challenge. So conceptual agility is about consideration of optionality, understanding the pros and cons. So when you put this proposal together, did you consider other options? What pros and cons did you analyse and work through? I'd really like to understand the different scenarios that you think this might play well to. So questions that really challenge the speaker to think about the options that are available to them and hold those options up against each other and analyse the difference. So that's what I think of when I'm training boards or working with boards or observing boards. I'm looking really to see those 4 behaviours in action. Empathy, because it builds trust and understanding and intention. Critical thinking, because it demonstrates that I've done my own analysis. Seeking information, because it broadens or deepens understanding. And conceptual agility, because it's really powerful behaviour which helps boards to really think laterally around the issues that they face. I hope this has been helpful, and I'm going to hand over now to Alex.
Thanks, Ali. Leslie, can you move on to slides?
I'm trying, yes.
That's okay. Well, I'll just get started.
You get started and...
Absolutely. I wanted to pick out one particular relationship that's arguably the most important in the functioning of any board, and that is the relationship between the chair and the chief executive. So firstly, let's look at how the relationship kind of should work, and then some of the challenges and how one can actually handle and manage and develop that relationship. All of what I say builds on what Alison has highlighted. Those 4 behaviours are absolutely critical in how this relationship comes into being. How should it work? Well, the chair is a non-executive role generally in most corporate boards. The chief executive is executive, which means the chief executive has the accountability for delivery. Okay. What that also means is the chair doesn't. The chair, however, is the leader of the board. The CEO is not the leader of the board. Therefore, the power is over on the other side here. The chair has invested their personal reputation in the job. They're often the visible front person of the board, and therefore their personal reputation is associated with the performance of that business or that board. They may have done it for the money, but in many boards, and certainly in the public and in the charity sector, they have not done it for the money. So it really is about them wanting to be associated with this role. The CEO, if they're working effectively with the chair, needs the support of the board in order to enact their strategy and deliver their contribution as leader of the business. The chair provides that support and that challenge that Ali has been talking about, and that's the nature and the foundation of the relationship with the CEO. And if the CEO is receptive and using those behaviours on the other side, is using the experience of the chair productively in order to have a critical friendship, as it's often described. Okay, so there's the objective: is both critical and it's a friendship. Okay, it's supportive. The two words of challenge and support. Can we move on to the next slide, Leslie?
I hope so.
Okay. So in making this relationship work, it really is about balancing the power between these two individuals. And balancing the power is why we get good governance. If the power balance doesn't work effectively, governance is impacted. Boards are designed with a tension point down the middle between the executives and the non-executive roles. And that's most clearly seen and most clearly copied in the relationship between the chair and the chief executive. If the relationship there becomes unproductive or dysfunctional, then what you might see is an overdominant chair or an overdominant CEO, or in fact, just a poor communication between the two, some dysfunction in how they work. What would you look for, and what do I look for as a board reviewer? Well, I look at the quality, quantity, and schedule of communication between the two individuals. So when you ask, can the chair or the chief executive, how often and how do you communicate? If they just say, oh, well, it's ad hoc, just on an as-needs basis. So it's not got a schedule, it's not regular, it's not, we have put this in the diary because it's important and we use this time regularly. Similarly, you can see in the boardroom itself, you can see dominant behavior. So I've seen in boards that I've reviewed, I've seen the chief executive, in a sense, taking over. Actually managing the board members where the chair goes quiet. Similarly, I've seen situations where the chair has been over-dominant in the boardroom and has, in a sense, infantilized the contribution of the CEO. The other thing that one can see is problems in the board process or in the board governance generally avoided by the chief executive or the chair, and certainly no alignment between the two in what needs to happen next. So these are things to look for. Look for that communication, look for the schedule, look for the quality of communication, and look at the dynamic in the boardroom. And then what to do if it's going wrong? Well, many years ago, there was the introduction of the senior independent director, okay, as a new role. And that role was introduced really in part to deal with this. And the SID role is often, in my experience, underused or under-highlighted in the board process. But this is where a good SID can come into their own. They can be an effective mediator. They can bring the parties together. And I've seen this done incredibly effectively where there is dysfunction and a lack of alignment between the chair and the chief executive, and that process is not working. So the SID can be a help. The board reviewer, if you're going through a board review, can be a help. They can be highlighting the problem and bringing the parties together to find a new way of working. And thirdly, the company secretary can actually make a contribution here. they can actually, in working closer with the chair, they can actually ensure that the chair is effectively leading the board, where maybe a chief executive has become over dominant in it. But it is about getting that power relationship in the right place. It is about ensuring that those behaviours that Ali highlighted are being used effectively. And it is about challenging the avoidance of getting the relationship in the right place, because it is that avoidance that, as I say in the slide, increases the governance risk. If there is no effective chair, chief executive, productive relationship, then the decision making will be damaged. Leslie, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Alex. And can I just, we've had a few questions coming in and our panelists are very kindly typing answers for them, but I believe that the attendees can't see the answers if you type them. I believe that the questions and answers only come through to us. So if we could, I'll tell you the question, and then if we could discuss the answer, that would be terrific. So the first one that we had says, questions often seem to generate justification rather than new information. How can this be changed both by the questioner and the responder? So Ali, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. I think first of all, justification is not necessarily a bad response, as it is sometimes a demonstration of confidence, which is a good thing because you want your execs to be confident. However, it can also feel somewhat defensive. I always find that using expression of feeling or asking a question about feelings will help to sort of build confidence that in the presenter to answer differently. So, for example, you might say, "What excites you about this proposal?" Open questions are really important. If someone's defensive, try presenting your question as a hypothesis. That can help. And also, don't be deterred. So, if you do get a defensive response, don't be shy. Keep coming back with another question or another angle, and that should give you more breadth in terms of what you're trying to find out or understand more of.
That's great, thank you. And then Mark's asked how you see the balance between the 4 behaviours you mentioned changing depending on the environment, and should we always try to keep them in balance?
So balance is important. However, I would say the more strategic the nature of decision, or if you're dealing with really big strategic decisions, then it's more important to focus on the 3 thinking behaviours. So seeking information, concept formation, critical thinking, and conceptual agility. In dealing with dilemmas, conflict, or high stress, definitely dial up on empathy.
Brilliant. And Anne's just pointed out that people can see the answers, so I was talking absolute rubbish. Very well.
Great.
But I still think it's worthwhile having the discussion. So someone else has asked, so we're talking about the chair and the chief executive relationship. Does it change if the chair is a top subject matter expert in the work of the organisation? They might be more inclined to be involved in the exec side of things, and how can or should that be managed, Alex?
Yeah, I think that is the risk. In many boards, the criticism of the executives will be that the non-executives, the chair being one of them, become too involved, to get too executive in approach. However, if that, and that's a sign that the chief executive either is insufficiently strong in pushing back and challenging back to the chair, that they are in the right place, or indeed it's a case that the dynamic, if you like, or the norm of behavior in the boardroom is that the non-executives are more executive and more invasive in how they do things. That happens, though, and happens legitimately when the non-executives have low confidence in the executive leadership of the business. they move, that dynamic, that position moves. So the chair will become more confident. The question is there sufficient trust, taking Ali's work, by the chair in the competence and the performance and the communication? So I would be looking at what information is being passed to the board in the boardroom, and is that information sufficient to keep the full board informed, to keep the chair informed? Does the chair know enough, or are they compensating for that by getting involved? So look at the communication, the content of the communication that's being passed.
Thank you very much. And Asif has asked, what are your views on companies that have merged the role of CEO and chair, and is that unique to the US?
Well, it's certainly not something that is advocated in the UK system, and I think there's enormous benefit in the separation of the roles, because it allows this challenge and support dynamic. And it stops all the power residing in one individual.
So can I add that? I mean,
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So we always say that the chair is there to run the board, and the CEO is there to run the organisation or the company, and they are very different roles. And as Alex said, you don't want all power in one person, and that really was where certainly the UK corporate governance regime was launched 30 odd years ago after the Maxwell scandal, or just one person, running both of those roles.
Yeah.
Thank you. Patricia asked, how about dealing with board relations in scale-ups where VCs have appointed a board member and the founders do not really know about governance? Are there any principles of governance and board for early stages, and how do you manage relations? Who wants to answer that one?
I was just going to say, I think it's really critical to have conversations about role. It is an education thing. Sometimes you have to start from the perspective of what's the role of the board, what's the role of the non-exec, and to really have a thorough discussion around that and help to build understanding of the role of governance, the role of the board, the role of the non-execs, and just really keep educating and coaching. That's a really critical job of anyone who's on the board, not just the chair.
I think just to add to that, I would say that when a board is new, when it's young, and it's kind of immature in its process, it needs to spend time together. So in order to get the trust and to build those relationships, the individuals have to spend time. They have to know both the formality of roles and accountabilities, but the informality of how the dynamic and how the informal roles in a boardroom are established and where they want them to go to. And building some form of board charter can be a good way of helping the board develop its way of working quickly when it's new.
Brilliant, thank you. And Joe's asked, he said that you mentioned that the SID role, in your opinion, seems not to be used as much, and so he wondered if you've got any suggestions for how to improve that situation.
I think every board should appoint one. I really do. I think I see the SID as an insurance policy for when things go wrong. It is not a deputy chair, and it is not the chair in waiting on a succession plan. So I see it as having a legitimate role in its own right. I absolutely encourage the boards that I work with to appoint the SID role wherever possible.
Everyone else is nodding. You obviously all agree with that. Mashwaz, apologies if I've pronounced that wrong, has asked, what about the behaviour of employees of two entities in influence of separate pre-boards after merger? How about the behaviour of employees of two entities and influence of separate pre-boards after merger, representing the two pre-entities? So I think that's about when when two businesses come together. Have you got any ideas on that?
I think one of the thoughts I would have about that is it's very important when two companies come together for the new entity to start to work on its own identity, and also to start to think about the shape of the new board. So again, having those questions live, one of the challenges, I think, one of the mistakes I think boards often make is they don't talk enough about the objectives of the board, the purpose of the board, and actually what they want the culture and code of conduct, for want of a better phrase, to be. And those sorts of questions start to help people shift their mindset away from what was to what we want to be and how we want to work. So that's a really important part of the process of creating a new identity.
I think just picking up on that too is one of the things that, in my view, not enough boards have are a set of board objectives, okay, that actually they explicitly say what we are focusing on this year. And when you've got a newly merged entity, I think there's those objectives, and being clear and communicating about those objectives can give a lot of comfort to the various parties on what the board is about and what it's focused on. I think the other thing is that in a new entity, it is useful that there are appointments made to the board who are brand new, who do not have history of one side or the other, and they come in fresh. And I think that adds to the new dynamic that you're trying to create with a new merged entity and a new merged board.
Brilliant, thank you. Someone's asked, in the US, does the lead independent director effectively fulfill the role of the chair?
I'm not expert in that, so I don't know.
Anyone else got any views?
So I was going to say that all of the US boards that I have worked with have appointed specifically and explicitly a chair. So I wouldn't expect necessarily lead independent director, in my view, would be more likely to be the equivalent of the SID.
Mm-hmm.
We have this in the UK. A lot of public sector boards don't call it the senior independent director, they call it the lead independent director. So I'd agree. I don't think it would be the chair. I think it would be taking that SID role on. Thank
you. So we have got a couple more questions, which I'm not ignoring, but I would like to move on now. We're halfway through the webinar, so I'd like to move on to Ian and Chris's presentations if we can, and if I can make the slides work. And then we'll come back. We will come back to the questions. So Ian, you're talking about going from being an exec to a non-exec.
Yeah, so if you could move the next slide, but don't worry if you can't. Oh, you can. It's fantastic. Thank you, Leslie. So I wanted to just really talk about this because this comes up a lot in board views. And certainly when I do observations, it's quite common to see an executive who, a non-exec who's had a recent executive career, sometimes not so recent, who just hasn't made that transition to being a non-executive. I guess the first thing we should say, make sure you really want to be a non-executive director. It sounds obvious, but I do quite a lot of training, and I always say if I put somebody off from being a non-exec because they think actually I don't really want to do it, then that's not a bad thing. I think the other thing to remember about doing a non-exec role, and I'm sure lots of you on this webinar know this, is it's not a way to make money. I often half jokingly say that being a non-exec or non-execs are cheap consultants because they certainly, most of them don't earn anywhere near what good consultants advising the board would earn. So I think it's really important to make sure that that you do want to do it. There'll be some real challenges. So for example, there's a challenge of time, and I'll come on to that. But also, you're never going to know as much as the executive. So when you're a non-executive, it's almost doing the role with your hand tied behind your back, because you just won't get you're not there. Well, hopefully you're not there on a day-to-day basis, so you won't have the amount of knowledge or indeed control that the executives have. So that really means that there needs to be a mind shift in the way that you operate and you think. So when should you start? And again, I'd say it's never too soon to start that journey, to start looking at non-exec roles. We talk a lot about diversity in corporate governance, and that could be gender, ethnicity, social diversity. But a thing that's come up a lot recently is age, and particularly with the onset of things like AI and digital will be much more in focus, whatever that term might mean. There is a real focus on having younger non-executive directors. So it really is something to think about early. I did a board review a couple of years ago where the CFO had just gone on the board as a non-exec, another board as a non-exec, a FTSE 250 at the age of 37. Now that's unusual, but it's not unheard of. So really it's something to start thinking about, and it's definitely not something to think I'll do this in my retirement. And I'm sure everybody on this webinar knows that. It's something to really think, actually, I want to do this. If you mention the word retirement, you'll definitely put the executive search organisations off you. So it's very, very much something to think about early on. Can you balance it with an executive career? Yes, you can. And I think, in recent times we've really lost something in having mostly portfolio heads and not having people who've tried to do it as being an executive at the same time. And there can be a huge benefit in having an executive from another company on your board as a non-exec. An obvious example is somebody with IT experience, because they'll be up to date. Lots of boards want non-execs with an IT background, but that goes out of date pretty quickly if you're not a current executive. So it's a really good focus to have somebody with an executive role elsewhere. I remember doing a review and interviewing a non-exec. She had a risk background and she was a CRO elsewhere. And she said, the company that I work for as an executive gets much more out of my non-executive role here than the actual company where I'm a non-exec. I bring back loads of things that we can use in my executive role. So there's if you're a sitting executive and you want to persuade your employer that you should be able to do a non-exec elsewhere, then it's a real argument to say, actually, we'll learn a lot from that, and I'll learn a lot from that, and that will help me with my day job. I think the next thing, though, to remember is don't underestimate the time pressure. And actually coming back, if you're a current executive and you sit on the board as a non-exec, if there's a crisis at the company where you're a non-exec, then that's going to have to take priority because it's your personal liability. So your day job almost takes a second place. So again, it's really important to make sure you've got the support of your employer if you're going to do a non-exec elsewhere. So don't underestimate the time commitment. Every time I do a review, I ask a non-exec, what's the time? What time do you spend every year doing this role? It's quite a difficult question to answer because obviously it's not just doing board meetings and preparing for board meetings. There could be lots of other things. But I don't think I've ever come across a non-exec who said it's just as in the letter of appointment stated it would be. It's always much more. And again, if you've got a crisis on at a board, or let's say that the board is doing any type of M&A activity, then you can double or triple the time. I've certainly done reviews a couple of years ago where a board had a crisis and people were working through the night, the non-execs were working through the night. So again, it can be very pressurized if something's going on where you're sitting on another board. The other thing to be careful about is, as many of you will know, the UK Corporate Governance Code is undergoing a consultation at the moment, and one of the things that non-execs are going to have to do is disclose their time commitment in the report of accounts of all of their roles. So if you're going plural, and I think it's a great thing, many people will want to do that. If you are going to have a plural career with a portfolio of different roles, just make sure you don't overboard. Because that's something that's going to become much more obvious. Again, I've seen non-executives just taken on too much. They don't contribute properly to to their boards because they're just too busy. So you know, in some sectors, for example, financial services, you're limited to I think 4 non-executive roles. That's probably enough for anyone. You don't want to have these situations where you've got 8 or 9 roles at once. It's just too many. Could we have the next slide, please? So I just wanted to talk briefly about the evolution from being an executive to a NED. I guess the first thing I would say here, not all very effective executives make effective non-executives. It's not a given that just because you've had a brilliant executive career, you're going to be a fantastic non-exec. So just one thing to think about, again, it's a very, very different approach to being on a board. I mentioned Peter Drucker. He said about effective managers that the effective manager listens first and speaks last. And I think you can apply that to the effective non-executive director as well. Don't feel when you go onto board for the first time as a NED that you've got to say something. You don't have to. Listening is much more important. Some of the best NEDs I've seen in board reviews are introverts. I remember doing one review where the non-exec was an extreme introvert. And he said, I'll say something if I need to. And he was probably the best non-exec on the board. Don't get into this habit of what we call layering, where people are just repeating what somebody else has said. You know, if they've said and made the point, that's fine. You don't need to repeat it. And an effective chair, of course, will bring you in. So, you know, if you're not getting the chance to speak, that's something to talk to the chair about. Secondly, the mandate of the board will vary, but generally it's big picture, and that's what you should focus on. We talk about boards being strategic and executive teams being operational. That doesn't always exist in practice, because if you've got a crisis, the board will have to become much more operational, as most boards did in COVID. But it still surprises me how many NEDs get involved in the detail. That's partly due to the amount of papers that are often produced and long presentations. So again, try and focus on the big picture. That's where you'll really add value. I would say your expertise, your executive expertise, is a third of the requirement for being a non-exec. You need to bring much more to the role than just your area of expertise. And as some of the codes have said, you know, board isn't just a group of subject matter experts. So make sure you can comment on areas outside your comfort zone. And finally, get to know the board and executives and colleagues well. Again, when I do reviews, I'm surprised how little the NEDs really try to get to know their colleagues, or indeed, you know, employees within the organisation. So it's really something to focus on. I ask about social diversity when I do board reviews, and again, the standard answer from non-executives, well, I don't know any of the backgrounds of my fellow board members. You'll really soak up the culture if you get to know people and get to know employees and walk the floor. Don't just invite people into the board, to actually go and walk the floor and get to know them. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks a lot. So Chris, over to you, and I will try and move the slides for you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. So I'm going to just talk a bit about the relationship between the executives and the non-executives. And in many ways, this is a sort of roundup of everything that we've talked about during this webinar. When I do board reviews, I think one of the interesting dynamics for me is actually how do the executives work together and how do the non-executives work together within the context of the board. If you take a sort of UK corporate governance code perspective, it tends you towards either the board as a whole or the contributions of individual directors. But I think this sort of halfway position of looking at the executives and looking at the non-executives is actually a helpful sort of line of review and analysis, because actually you have within that the real sort of dichotomy or the real nexus of a board decision. So if we kind of look at the respective roles, and I appreciate that this is in many ways sort of repeating what has been said already, but I think it's a useful sort of summary of all that we've been talking about. On the one hand, you do have the executive directors who are obviously the people in the business who know what's going on, know what the issues are, and know what needs to be discussed with the board. So they are the ones who set the agenda and, of course, provide information to the board. And on the other hand, you've got the non-executive directors who, as you know, will receive the information, and it's their job to evaluate it. And then within the decision-making process, you have the executive directors sort of taking questions, answering them, and then going back to Ali's presentation, the role of the non-executives in sort of challenging and encouraging. And as we've sort of heard within the presentation today, you know, we talk about power, we talk about relationship, and we talk about support and encourage. And I think the way in which all of those things work together within the decision-making process is key to how successful the relationship is between the executives and non-executives. And certainly in my experience, where the two sort of components of the board get that right, they are generally a successful board, an effective board. And when they don't, then that's where you get the problems. I think if I can just pick up one of the questions we haven't answered and actually talk about controlled companies, one of the interesting features where you have got a dominant shareholder who has a representative on the board is, where does that director sit within this balance? And I think the issue in that situation does depend on whether your controlling shareholder representatives on the board are erring towards the executive side of the equation or the non-exec, and actually how those roles play out will sort of set the pattern for how the controlling shareholder relationship works. In my experience, controlling shareholders having appointees on the board is probably more prevalent than actually a lot of people would realize, even within listed companies. And the issue there is not so much, in my opinion, how that position may or may not be abused. It's how the relationship is managed, whether that relates to conflicts of interest or, to the point here, the sort of balance of information and knowledge, and how that sort of played into a strong independent discussion between all of the participants on the board. And for me, that's the key. I think two other key points worth bringing out in the context of this sort of central analysis of the decision-making process. One is the importance of relationship, as in the personal relationship between directors. And I think it's easy to sort of analyze a board decision and the board discussion in the context of the specific point being discussed. But the context of the relationships between directors is actually really important. And if you have a board that actually does spend time on the sort of social side of the relationships between directors and non-execs, perhaps through board dinners, or use time outside of the board meeting to provide maybe briefings or site visits or other things that enable the two parties, as it were, to be learning together and working together and socializing together, that actually creates a good foundation for the specific discussions and relationships that you might have within the boardroom. I think the other point is going back to my point about how the teams work together. And I think this picks up on some of the conversation we've had so far around the directors playing to their strengths and their subject area expertise. I think where I see this relationship working well is where you get a healthy respect for all that the particularly non-execs bring it to the relationship, but without being too defined by the specific swim lanes of your accounting or your IT expertise, and a willingness to be actually able to ask and sort of answer the dumb questions as much as the really sort of technical and sort of subject heavy questions. So I think the decision is the microcosm of all that goes on in this relationship, but actually it takes place in a wider context, and it's really important for the boards to work on that wider context so that these respective roles of exec and non-exec can kind of show themselves in their best light and in their best effectiveness. Leslie, can you move on, please?
Yep.
So just moving on to a few pointers perhaps to pick out of that. And again, this goes back to some of the things that we've talked about throughout this whole discussion. For executive directors, I think, one of the worst things I think for NEDs to experience when they're in a sort of discussion with the exec directors is a real sort of defensiveness and a sort of evasiveness almost about either information or willingness to engage in debate. Sometimes poor directors will use, sort of knowledge as almost weaponize it and sort of use the lack of it or the poverty of it to try and sort of inhibit debate. And that obviously isn't helpful. But I think there is this sense of executive directors coming to the board with a heavy emotional investment in the matter that they usually presenting to the board for approval. And I think this is particularly prevalent in sort of merger and acquisition proposals, where by the time you get to the board, executive directors are heavily invested in it, either reputationally or because they want to do a deal for whatever reason, and actually can kind of really try and steer the discussion to the outcome they want, rather than necessarily allowing the sort of spotlight of analysis and sort of dispassionate discussion to really show whether or not this is a good thing to do. And so I think on the executive director's side, there does need to be that sort of fairness going into the discussion that enables them to be receptive to whatever comes back from their non-executive directors and sort of open-minded about what's being discussed. I think on the non-executive side, the challenges can be around the information, and to Ian's point, sometimes executive directors going into non-exec roles may just want to get more and more and more information, which can be very irritating for executive directors when they feel that they've provided what you need to be able to make an informed decision. And so that balance of whether you're providing too little or too much information is a really important part of the decision-making dynamic. And the timeliness of information is so important, I think. And the number of boards that just get papers out, with a day or so's notice, and that's about it, really, I don't think understand the importance of actually having time to digest information when you're a non-executive director, and perhaps more importantly, actually have time for dialogue before you even get into the boardroom, so that information can be clarified, or points that they want to raise discussed in advance, so that it's not sort of taking too much time in the meeting. And generally for non-execs to be non-execs and not try and micromanage discussion and second guess what the execs will have spent a lot of time doing. So in summary, around the decision-making process, I think there are some sensible things that make for good decision-making, that really leverage the contributions of the two sides, as it were. One is the quality of the papers. Two is the timeliness of circulation, presentation, and three is the facilitation of discussion. None of this is rocket science, but you'd be surprised how often problems within the boardroom arise because of one or more of these factors not being particularly well handled. With that, I'm happy to take questions, or Leslie, I guess we'll open the discussion out now.
Yep, no, that's brilliant. Thanks a lot, Chris. So we've got some more open questions coming up. So Chris Braithwaite has said he's curious. We've talked about the board members, but he's curious about whether or not you've got any insights on roles or best practices for other people involved, such as the board secretary. You mentioned the board secretary, Alex. Other executive side attendees at board meetings, the chief exec support team, independent members of committees, etc. And this question is open for anyone.
I think with the company secretary and the secretariat, you know, whatever is available, they're often seen as more at the administrator end of things rather than the value added end of things. And good company secretaries can add tons of value to the board process and can be a real support to the chair. And getting that relationship right between the company secretary and the chair can really enable a board to thrive. It depends obviously in the background and the capability of the individuals involved, but I think facilitating a discussion at the board about what they want from the company secretariat and what it could, and the company secretariat providing evidence of what is possible that it could provide, some NEDs being unaware of that, really helps.
Brilliant, Alex. Thank you. Ian, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, I mean, I think the company secretary is a critical role, and I think if you look in the UK Corporate Governance Code, for example, it outlines how important it is. So, you know, and I always say I see a lot of general counsel who take on the role and think it's going to be quite an easy role to do, and it isn't, because it is built very much on those personal relationships, and that can be difficult. I mean, I always say, if you're the co-sec and you're sitting in the boardroom, you're the only person who isn't equal with everyone else. I think the only other thing I would add is, in terms of the other roles you've mentioned, just be careful about having too many people attending in board meetings or committees in particular. I mean, I've seen audit committees where you get, you know, the 3 members of the committee and there are 20 people in the room, and that can make it quite difficult, you know, because you'll have, you know, obviously employees in the organisation plus perhaps the external auditors. So something to watch.
Thank you, Ian. I've got another question here asking about board objectives. Do you have any examples of good board objectives that you could share? What's a good board objective?
I think a good board objective is relevant to that board. I think it really matters that the board objectives reflect the position of the board, how new it is, how, you know, what it's challenged with, and what's happening in that business at that time. So good board objectives are not generic. They're very specific, and they deal with both board process and board content.
And there's a lot being done on board purpose at the moment in corporate governance, being absolutely clear what your purpose is. But I think that's very important, and you know, your purpose may change over time. But I think equally important is to focus on board dynamics. So not just about, you know, what the board's purpose is, but how does it work most effectively together. One thing I often, when I work with boards, suggest is they have that conversation once a year. I suspect if most boards did, the 5 of us will be out of work, because actually it is talking about what's working and what isn't. You know, what irritates the non-execs, what irritates the executives, what would they welcome? With, as Ali said in her first session, you know, the executives say we'd actually welcome more challenge from you as non-execs. We're not having sufficient challenge. So again, I think we need to focus on that as well as just board objectives and board purpose.
Thank you. And then got another question asking how the board and executive can identify when they've entered collective groupthink that might be unhelpful, which is probably always going to be unhelpful. Have you got any tips for how you can identify that and what to do about it?
So I think part of this is about the board spending sufficient time reflecting on lessons learned. and sometimes doing some review of decision making. So, you know, 6 months ago we made this decision. Let's just look back on how we made that decision, what options we considered, whether we would have done something differently in hindsight. So the discipline of sort of review and reflect is a really helpful way to bring to the fore groupthink if it's in evidence. I think also the discipline of the behaviour that I talked about, conceptual agility. So constantly asking questions about optionality and really broadening the thinking around options that might be possible, not necessarily obvious, and the discipline of thinking through multiple different scenarios. So that can be helpful, and having a helpful external perspective, I think can start to raise awareness of, you know, a board review should raise awareness of any collective groupthink. And if you a really helpful thing to do if you're interested is there is a very useful test that you can get online about unconscious bias. So you can do it on yourself, and it's a really good thing for a board to do, for each board member to test their unconscious bias. And that usually brings up some really interesting questions around actually how biased or how much we do tend to resort to groupthink.
Thank you. Ian, you've got your hand raised again.
Yeah, sorry. I suppose the other thing is focus on diversity and have people with different experiences and different backgrounds. So one of the things that I think is regressive in the financial services sector is the view of some people in the regulators that you must have non-executive got a financial services background. And people in a bank, people in an insurance company who serve as NEDs will ask similar types of questions, whereas actually I've seen some really effective NEDs who, particularly in financial services, who come from a completely different background, and they will ask the obvious questions, but they're the questions that the other people won't think about. So I think in terms of groupthink, making sure that your board is diverse in the absolute widest sense of that word.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We're coming up to close now, I'm afraid. We've still got a few questions unanswered. I'm delighted to say that our team of experts have agreed to write an article, or 2 articles for governance over the next couple of months. And so what we'll do is we'll try and pull in answers to your questions into those articles. And someone's asked Ali here for the oh, you answered it.
Sorry.
For the test. I was just going to say if we'll send round. Yeah, we'll find the test. We'll find a link to the test, and when we send you a link to the recording of the session, we'll try and make sure we include that in there as well. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all our 4 speakers. Fascinating session, really important topic. And also to thank all of you for your questions, which were absolutely excellent and really thought-provoking. So thank you very much indeed. I hope you found this useful, and I hope we see you at another one. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.